Are you unintentionally designing a bad legacy? Welcome this lovely morning to the Design Your Legacy podcast. We have the pleasure to introduce you to John K. Ross. He is an elder law attorney with decades of experience, and he also runs the largest elder law firm in Texas as well as Arkansas. Welcome, Mr. Ross.
Howdy, glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today from I believe you're in one of your offices in Arkansas.
Yeah, I'm currently in Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Very, very nice, very nice. And I got a kick out of your prior podcast I was sharing with you in the preamble. You definitely brought the humor. So let's actually start with kind of a deeper subject, but we'll try and make it a little bit light. And the subject is, I thought, the story of Isaac, because I think that no matter where someone is sitting today, in their car or on an airplane listening to this podcast, perhaps, that is a story that they might understand, whether they are of the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, or they've just heard it because it's kind of within the cultural fabric of our society.
Well, yeah, I talk a lot about people's failure to plan. That they have things that they want, right? They have ideas, they have intentions. In fact, I'll have clients come to me and they'll say, "Well, my dad always said he wanted this, right, or whatever it is, right?" And yet people, they don't do it. They think about it, but they don't do it. And this is such a common situation that we can go all the way back to the Old Testament, right? And so you've got Isaac. He's married to Rebecca. He's got his two kids, Esau and Jacob, right? And Esau he's the oldest boy, right? And he's kind of a big man's man. He's kind of a hairy kid. Almost think about like that 1970s Burt Reynolds, the cover of Playgirl magazine, where he's laying on the bearskin rug and the big hairy chest and everything, right? That's Esau, right?
So Esau is Peyton Manning.
There you go, right? Yeah, so yeah, he's the right. And then yeah, we got Jacob over here, he's kind of the mama's boy, and certainly Rebecca's favorite, right? Well, if you
Not
go
Peyton
back,
Manning.
right. So you go back to that time and that age, and the Jewish people at the time, these were not wealthy folks, right? So what they had to leave behind was their blessing. And there's actually a Yiddish term for this that I cannot pronounce, and so I'm not even going to try. But here we have Isaac, and the Jewish tradition is you're going to bestow your blessing, which is essentially leaving your inheritance and your legacy and your knowledge and everything else. You're going to leave all of this to your oldest son, right?
Yeah.
That's Esau. He's going to do it. He's going to leave it to Esau.
And what I found so interesting about this is oftentimes it was an oral contract, traditionally speaking, almost like a pledge.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
And in
Yeah,
many ethnic cultures, they don't write it out. It's a verbal agreement.
that's right. It's not like what we would think about like a will, where you got fancy paper and two witnesses that are sitting there watching you sign something, right? No, this was an oral tradition, and they're gonna pass this on down. And so and everybody, that's the interesting thing, is if you would have asked anybody, everybody knew what Isaac's plan is. He's going to bestow his blessing on his oldest boy, Esau. That's what everybody does. Everybody knows the plan, but he doesn't do it. He doesn't actually get around to do it. He doesn't make anything happen. And he waits and he waits and he waits. And at some point, the Bible's describing him as blind. He's basically bedridden. And in our practice, where we see a lot of elderly people, we actually have a term for this. We refer to folks in this situation as frail, vulnerable, but not incompetent, right? These are the folks you'll hear they got scammed. Maybe it was at one time they were an executive, or they were a CPA or a professor at a university, and now they're getting duped by some scammer, right? It's not that they're incompetent; they're just so frail and vulnerable that they're easily manipulated. And this is basically the stage that Isaac's in, and he on top of that, he knows he's about to die. But even then,
Yeah. So
even then,
what's so interesting about that is how vulnerable that individual is at that moment, that if they're not like clearly, in control of all of their senses, that this is where the bait and switch happens.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so here's Isaac, and you've probably done this. I've done this. You've got something you don't really want to do. You know you need to do it, but you don't really want to do it, right? And so you put something else ahead of it, right? Oh, well, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna go wash those dishes, right? But you something else, and then you're going to get around to it. And this is Isaac, and he's telling Esau, he says, hey, here's what we're going to do. You're going to go out and hunt me my favorite food, my favorite meal, bring it back. We're going to have a big stew. And once we do that, then I'm finally going to get around to bestowing this blessing, passing my estate, leaving my legacy. I'm finally going to get around to doing that. And so Esau, being the dutiful child, he tears off out into the forest, goes off and does the running, right? Well, meanwhile, we got Rebecca, the wife, and she's got her ear to the door. She's listening, and she's looking over at her favorite son, Jacob, and she says, look, you're about to miss out on this deal. Your older brother's going to get everything. You're going to get squat. You need to get in there. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to go in there and you're going to pretend like you're your older brother, because your old man, he's so frail and vulnerable. He's so blind. He's so bedridden. He'll never know the difference. That's her idea. Now, Jacob.
And they're not the only family that's there where they're scheming. Keep going.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this could be like the next episode of Yellowstone or something, right? And so, Jacob, he's no fool, and he's looking at mom. He's like, Mom, I'm a little skinny twerp of a kid, right? And my brother's this big hairy beast of a man. There's no way the old man's gonna think that I'm Esau. And she's like, oh no, I got this figured out. We're gonna wrap you up in some goat fur. And so she goes and wraps him up in goat fur, sends Jacob in there with his old man, and poor Isaac, all he can do is reach out. He can touch that goat fur, thinks he's talking to Esau, and he ends up bestowing his blessing on the child he never intended, right? So his whole plan, the plan that everybody knew was his plan, it goes awry right there at the end because of his failure to actually make it happen or do it in a way that would hold up.
Well, that's formalized and protected.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Doing something that's going to be concrete and that's not going to create a disaster. And I'm not a theologian necessarily, right? So I'm not going to get into, I made the mistake one time as telling this story, and I said, he ended up bestowing his blessing on the wrong child, and depending on your religious interpretation, no, you would say, well, no, that was the right thing because that was God's intention, and blah blah blah. And I kind of got the where's for from a preacher that was in the audience that my use of the term wrong child was so I'm very careful to say the one he did not intend.
Words are powerful.
words can be powerful, right? But in the end, I mean, if you look at the totality of the Old Testament, right, this all works out. It only took a couple of thousand years of war, to solve it, right? And that's what that's why I'm talking to people. I'm like, look, you can so easily make what seems like a relatively small mistake or maybe just something that you omitted. And yet that becomes your legacy because it creates this contention within the family or something else on the back end. And that's what I really don't want people to do.
Absolutely.
I want there to be one of taking care of business and planning, and it's awesome. And the kids look back and they're like, wow, that's how I want to do it when I die, right? I want it to go like that.
Yeah. One of the things, and I don't know if you listen to the music of Celine Dion, but when her husband had passed away, he put every bit of those affairs in order so that she didn't have to worry and it could be easier on her.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what you want, whether you're the surviving spouse, whether you're a child. I mean, anybody who's ever lost a loved one, I mean, they know the kind of grief that goes along with that. And you don't want to tack on anything to that grief. And even better, if you can find something inside that grief to be able to celebrate. And even if it may seem like such a simple thing, but I will have clients that come into my office and my previous client, who I did their planning for, and maybe they've died, and I've got the kids coming in or the surviving spouse coming in, and they're so concerned that there's going to be all this stuff to do, and how much is it going to cost, and blah blah blah. And when I get the opportunity to tell them, hey, it's actually done. I mean, there's really nothing for y'all to do, you know. I mean, there may be a few phone calls, right? You need to call these pension people and tell them to stop making the pension checks out, but you're done because Dad took care of it. He handled this. Y'all don't have to. And you can see the relief on them. You can see the stress just drain right out of them. That's a heck of a deal for them.
Yeah, and it's a very different conversation than when there are the resentments.
Oh yeah, certainly. Right. Yeah, compare that to, I years ago I had a family, and it was a blended family, and there was, the guy had died, and he had a wife, he had kids from a prior marriage, he also had a business partner, and he had a plan that he had kind of done, but basically nothing in the plan happened the way he had envisioned it happening. And this had to have been a decade ago, maybe more, maybe 15 years ago. And I actually ran into, I was at Walmart or someplace just here in the last few weeks, and I ran into the son who was my client during that whole mess. And yeah, he was a nice guy then, he's a nice guy now. But he walked, I saw him, I kind of waved at him, he came over and he was like, "Hey, how's it going?" And I said, "Oh, great." And he said, "Hey, I just wanted to thank you. I mean, you walking us through that time. It was such an awful experience. But here we are. I mean, it's 15 years after his dad died. And when he thinks about his dad, he doesn't think about going to a baseball game or that vacation or that time his dad bought him his bicycle. He doesn't think about any of that. His dad's legacy now is this year and a half worth of contested legal process involving a stepmother and a business partner and thousands of dollars in legal fees and all of these other things. That's his dad's legacy, and it always will be. And that's really unfortunate, because I bet there's lots of better things that son could remember about his dad.
Sure, sure. The weekend baseball, softball games,
Exactly. Right.
picnics, the holidays, the birthday parties, all the good intentions and the follow through. So let me ask you this: why do you think that people procrastinate this inheritance conversation?
Well, that is a good question. On the one hand, this is something that's easy to put off, right? I mean, uh, I'm going to die.
Okay.
You're going to die.
Is it that
Right?
some people just think that they're immortal because in the media we see the bling bling and it's going to go on forever? Or is it like, I think your business associate mentioned that people will spend more time planning for their next vacation. And I have to wonder if it's like in the pleasure versus pain aspects of our brain, if it's just that people just want to have the dopamine hits and not think about structuring and
Yeah, I
being
think there's certainly some truth to that, right? I mean, it's not a comfortable conversation necessarily. I know when I first started doing this kind of work, and at the time I'm like 28, right? And I'm talking to Wendell and Mabel, and they're in their 80s, and I'm talking about death, which is real to them. It probably the next year or two. But to me, it's this abstraction at 28, right?
well, it's not
At
so
20, and so
personal
it's
to
hard.
you.
It's right.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think you're right. It is an uncomfortable conversation. It's also one. If I were to ask you right now, and I was going to say, okay, which is going to happen first, your death or dinner tonight?
The human brain's going to go to dinner and food.
Right, you're going to say, "Well, I'm going to have dinner tonight." In fact, that reminds me, I need to get on and make some reservations, because we were going to go out and I've been wanting that. Been wanting to go to that new tapas place and get me some. I'm going to get some bottle of Spanish wine, and it's going to be awesome. And I hear you're thinking about all that. You're already Googling the menu so you can pre-plan out what appetizers you're going to get, right? And that's because you again, but you don't know that. You have no idea what's coming next,
Yeah.
right? Asteroid crashes through the roof right now, you're gone.
Yeah, I think one of the things you had mentioned is that if somebody has a reference point in their life, then they almost like know better that they need to put these affairs in order. Um,
Sure.
one of the things you mentioned on a previous podcast that I thought was so interesting, that somebody will come into your office, and if they haven't thought about their legacy planning, let's say, and we're talking the formalized legal, and we're going to get into those educational details in a moment, but if they haven't thought about it in 70 years, then they come into your office and they almost want to like now,
Oh
they'll
yeah.
fuss at you for the next 10 days and kvetch at you.
Oh, and I will tell you, COVID has made this even worse, right? Because pre 2020, right? Yes, you would have folks, and like you said, here's a 70-year-old. They've done no planning up until age 70, right? So we've got 70 years of history, and they come in, and almost one of their first questions is going to be, well, how quickly can you get this done? Like now that they've committed to doing a will or a trust or something, it's like, oh well, we've got like 48 hours, and it is funny, it's a kind of a funny mindset. And on the one hand, I get it, they've committed, and that maybe that was a hard hurdle for them, was just to commit to doing the planning, right? And now that they've committed, the last thing that they want to do is wait to have it done. So some of that, but I will say COVID it made it even much worse, because you had people who they had friends, especially in these older generations, right? With that's where you saw most of the death during the COVID process, was during these older folks who were more susceptible. And they're seeing their church friends and their neighbors who are the same age, who were healthy as an ox on Tuesday and dead on Thursday. And those folks were coming in, and they really were, particularly during the 2001 time frame. I mean, they wanted it done as fast as possible. And I mean, I get it, I get the fear of it, but yeah, it is somewhat ridiculous to think, oh yeah, well, I've gotten by without it for 70 years, but somehow I need to get it done in the next 4 minutes, because something's going to happen to me. And that's for the older folks. The younger people, like, you're younger, and if you came to me right now and said, John, I want to do some estate planning, the very next question out of my mouth is, where are you going on vacation? And I guarantee there would be an answer to that. You would say, oh, how did you know I'm going on a cruise on Friday? I bet that's because if you're young, the only reason you're probably doing some planning is because you think, oh, geez, I'm going on this cruise, and what happens if I fall off the rail?
Yeah. Or that sandwich generation, if they do have to take care of their parents and they find themselves, with not just the responsibility for their own life, but now they have to manage a new project, and yeah, responsibility is a very interesting thing. I almost, before we dive into the educational bit of the 5 mistakes, I almost wonder if it's like you're asking them to go into this like unknown territory. And I know you got that Marine Corps background, and it's like, well, congratulations, you're in the unknown territory, and I'm going to keep you there for 4 days. How does that feel?
Right. Yeah, yeah, we've committed to doing this, but then it's not done yet. And what happens? And I've had people that ask that. Well, in fact, that's a pretty common question. Is well, what happens if something happens to us before you get this done? Right? What happens if we die in the next week before you are able to complete all of this? And I'm like, well, the same thing that would have happened yesterday if you'd have died. I mean, nothing. It's no different, so yeah, and I usually joke with them. I say, look, how about this? Don't die. You
Oh,
just
that's
don't
good.
die for a week. If you can hold off for 1 week, we should be good.
Yeah, and I think, again, like I mentioned in the preamble, I think it's so good that you bring your sense of humor to these conversations, because you almost have to. Because if not, the
Oh,
person could melt down right in front of you, because it's number one, they haven't thought about these things. And so we're going to jump into the 5 biggest mistakes, which I think are very educational. And there were some insights I didn't know, but I think, again, like you had said, it's like if they've never thought about this, not only are they in a territory that they're not familiar with, now all the blind spots are just
right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, and to some extent, you don't know what you don't know. Which is why we've always tried to do so many different things to get our voice out there to say, look, y'all need to be thinking about these things. And yeah, you mentioned like my 5 big mistakes, a presentation that I have given in various formats, probably 10 or 20,000 times, because it kind of points out, here's the things that I see probably most commonly that people screw up. They screw it up before they ever get to me. And like particularly like number one, right? I'm an estate planning attorney. That's our primary thing. I mean, we do other stuff, but mostly we do estate planning and asset protection. And when people hear estate planning, in fact, I was just talking to somebody else the other day, and then oh well, so you do wills? Well, I probably need to get a will, right? So every day I've got somebody coming in. Hey, will you look at my will? We did it online. Will you take a look at it? Or how do you do a will? But it's always will. Everybody wants to talk about a will. You don't hear lawyers, generally speaking, make a whole lot of promises out there. Like if you watch those, those TV lawyers that are standing on top of the 18-wheeler talking about how many millions of dollars they're going to get you, But if you look at the bottom of that commercial, it says, "We do not guarantee results," right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I tell you what, I'm gonna guarantee every single listener to this podcast right now. I'm gonna guarantee them they will not care whether or not they have a will. They'll be dead before it matters to anybody, right?
And
I mean, and yet, but that's the focus. I need
yeah.
a will.
So what's
But
the more
it's the
important
key.
document?
Yeah, exactly, right? So instead of it's like people get to like particularly in that retirement age, right? They get to 55, they get to 65, somewhere in there, and then their brain just jumps to what happens when we die. But you're going to be disabled before you die. You're going to be incapacitated before you die.
Yeah, unless it's nice, quick, and easy. You're right. So there are those phases.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know,
Typically.
if you get to age 80, your statistical likelihood of being incapacitated for a period of time prior to death is something like 93%, right? You ever tried to call the phone company if your name's not the one on the account? Right? If it's in your dad's name or your mom's name or your husband's name or your wife's name, if I want a new phone, if I want to go trade in my phone and go to Verizon right now, I got to drag my wife with me because she set up the account. It's in her name. They won't talk to me without talking to her. Right? So before we ever get to a will, we need to focus on making sure we have the paperwork in place so that if, for example, my wife is incapacitated, maybe she's had a stroke, maybe she gets Alzheimer's, we need the paperwork that I can handle business on her behalf. I can talk to the phone company. I can talk to the electric company. I can talk to her doctors. I can get copies of her medical records. What does she want at the end of life? If she's on life support, but she's never going to get any better, what does she want? So that I can honor it, right? And so yeah, having powers of attorney and medical directives, those are much more important to you than a will ever will be.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the key points that you highlighted in prior podcasts, that the financial power of attorney is such a key document, and it encompasses not just like the cell phone company and the phone company, but also Apple accounts and things that we don't think of in today's day and age that is so second nature to us, maybe even social media. But it's like if all of that is listed out, I think in fact you had said that sometimes it's not what's written in the financial power of attorney, it's what's left out that becomes the thing, whether it's like the government or relatives or business associates. It's all that language that has been left out that's unclarified.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like for example, if I were to appoint you to handle business on my behalf, if I became incapacitated, I mean, I think everybody could agree then that your job is going to be to use my assets for my benefit, right? Well, that makes pretty good sense. But let's say that I'm going to a nursing home and it's going to cost $6,000, $7,000 a month. Well, the only other way to pay for that, other than writing a $7,000 check every month, would be to qualify for a government benefit like Medicaid. Well, I have 4 ungrateful children that are all relatively young, and there's actually a rule in Texas where I live that says that I could transfer my assets to college accounts for my children and make myself eligible for Medicaid in the process. Right? And if you asked me and you said, John, would you rather spend all your money at the nursing home, or would you rather your money go to the college accounts for your ungrateful children? I would say, yeah, give it to the little buggers. You know, that I'd rather it be them than the nursing home, right?
And
Except,
I'm
go
sorry, I
ahead.
just wanted to key in for a second that I think this conversation is so important because we don't oftentimes get these conversations in the typical day-to-day interactions, and therefore the financial literacy is left out until, like you said, the very last minute. So we don't even know that we need to have these documents in place. And I want to highlight a television show before you keep going on
Yeah.
about the second mistake, which is about, giving things away as a remedy, which is not a great remedy unless it's like in a trust, but you can speak of it. There was a show on Netflix called Dirty Money and Guardianship, and
Uh-huh.
have you seen it?
I have, yes.
Yeah, and there were elderly individuals, whether it was Boston, maybe even Texas, around the country, and if they didn't have their paperwork shored up, they could have saved their entire lives and had a portfolio of real estate, and then found themselves, basically with a quarter on the side of the road.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's the alternative. Like these powers of attorney that we're talking about, being able to appoint people in advance to handle stuff when you become incapacitated. Because if you don't have those, the alternative is that court guardianship. It's that entire Netflix program, right? You now have a judge and you've got attorneys and guardians, and all of these people now are involved in your life, and ain't none of them doing it for free.
Or maybe even in your best behalf, even though they're
Or,
supposed to be
yeah,
fiduciaries.
right. In a good world where everybody is operating with the best intentions, it's expensive and time consuming. That's in the best case scenario, right? In the worst case scenario, there's outright fraud and abuse and exploitation. And why subject yourself to all of that when you could prevent it with some relatively simple stuff? And yeah, so kind of like you said, other mistakes of people will hear these sort of things, right? And they'll hear about, well, if I go to a nursing home, I heard they're going to take my house, or I'll lose my assets. So before that ever happens, I'm going to I'm gonna deed everything to my kids, right? I'm gonna deed my house to my kids, and that way when I go to the nursing home, they can't take it. And for example, we had this here recently. We had a lady, and that's exactly what she had done. She had deeded her house to her two children, thinking that if she went to the nursing home, they were going to take her house, right? So she deeds the house to her two daughters. And then one of the daughters died. And that daughter, she left all of her stuff she had a will. She had done a little simple will, and her little simple will said, I leave everything to my husband, right? So now mom's living in a house that's owned half by one daughter and half by the former husband of her deceased daughter, who of course has now remarried. And the woman he remarried has two kids that are not her grandchildren. And so I've got this lady in the office saying, how I want to get my house back. How do I get my house back? Well, you don't. You gave it away. And once you take your stuff and you give it to somebody else, it's just not yours anymore. And so people think that if they take their stuff and they give it to their kids, that they're protecting assets. They're not. All they're doing is they're trading one set of problems for another set of problems,
Because
right?
it's piecemeal and they don't see the full picture.
And people think of this in one direction. They think of health and all of these sort of things, right? Like, I'm the older generation, so I'm the one that's going to go to a nursing home, right? So I'm going to put my stuff in my kids' name because they're the younger generation. Well, walk into a nursing home. Yeah, there's a bunch of old people. There's a couple of young ones, right? Do you drive a car? Because if you do, you're one wreck away from being in a nursing home. And so, here, if mom puts her house in son's name and son's in a car wreck with a catastrophic brain injury, he's the one in the nursing home. You didn't solve anything.
Yeah, and those are the things we don't think about unless we have a reference point that we knew Sally, Bill, or Bobby, and they have that experience to now it's like it wakes us up out of our slumber almost, that life might not, go as we think it's going to go. Like we're not guaranteed the idealism that we see on television or in the movies.
Right. Well, and the funny thing about that, I mean, you mentioned, your friends Sally and Bill and all of that. That's actually the next mistake, because the next mistake is getting bad advice about this stuff. Right. And that's because, what Bob and Sally did in their situation, in some cases it worked, but not because it was the right thing to do, but because their particular set of facts and circumstances made it work. Right. And this is where, again, and particularly if you're in particularly that older age group, they're sitting around in their little social group, their little church group, their little ladies group, whatever it is, and somebody mentions nursing home, and somebody else says, oh, well, when my parents in 1942, when they were about to die, they deeded their house to me and my sister, and it worked out just fine. And so I'll tell all of y'all right now here in this little church group, y'all all need to be putting your house in your kids' names. That's what we did. Worked out just fine. Right? Well, that's ridiculous. That lady doesn't know anything. She doesn't know how to do it. And yeah, did it work fine in their situation? Yes.
But
Does that mean it's
today
going to
is
work fine?
different. Hmm.
Right. Yeah,
Hmm.
different laws, different time frame, different fact scenarios. And so, people do need to get good advice out there. And the flip side of that, though, is, finding, when you're trying to find people that are giving good advice, you also do have to watch out for the scammers, because there are folks out there who do know some things, and these folks have also learned something fundamental about humanity, and that is, if you tell somebody about 3 or 4 true things, they will believe the 4th or 5th thing that you tell them, which is a lie.
Yeah.
And like, for example, I do a lot with veterans benefits, particularly for the older veterans that are going into nursing homes and their spouses. And there's a veterans benefit program that can help pay for nursing home care and assisted living. And I have run into these scammers out there they'll find this person and they'll say, oh, I hear you're going to this assisted living and it's really, really expensive. Well, I've got good news for you. Did you know that because you served on active duty during a war period, that you're a wartime veteran? True statement.
Okay.
Did you know that because you're a wartime veteran, there is a benefit called the aid and attendance benefit? True statement. When your husband died, who was that wartime veteran, that benefit is now eligible to you as the surviving spouse because you were married to him at the time of their death. Statement number 3, that's true. And I can help you get this benefit. And all we really need to do is take your investments over here and put them into this product that I'm selling, this annuity or this insurance policy or whatever it is. And once you do that, you can qualify for this benefit. Lie. But it sounded good, didn't it?
Well, it was running up to like the plane was about to take off into some good news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
if you
people
do
don't
all of
read the
these
fine
things,
print oftentimes.
right, yeah, you do all of these things, and we're going to get you this VA benefit. And the fact is, they probably would get you the VA benefit, but that's because the only thing that mattered were the first 3 or 4 things. The 5th thing was irrelevant. It was just a good way for that guy to get an 8% commission off of your entire net worth. So you do have to watch out for the scammers that are out there. So get second opinions. When I have clients come to me and they say, John, that sounds a little weird, I've never heard of that before. Well, fine, I don't care. Go ask other people. I'll show you the rules. I'll show you the law. I don't care. I do not mind somebody questioning me and getting a second opinion. And hide anything.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you're talking to somebody and you say, that seems a little odd, I think I'm going to get a second opinion, maybe go talk to an elder law attorney. And that person is saying, oh, you don't want to go see that. You don't want to go talk to that elder law attorney. They're just going to cost you a bunch of money. And I'm already telling you everything you need to know. You don't need to look it up. You can just trust me on this whole deal. yeah, you probably should be running away from that person.
Yeah, run, don't walk. I think that's brilliant advice to always get that second and third opinion, whether it's to verify it or just to get another perspective, because there's so much to know in the landscape. And again, it's like if people don't have these conversations on a regular basis, even though you mentioned that with COVID, people now, are becoming much more aware, like even in the public consciousness, that they need to put
Mhm.
their affairs in order sooner than later. Yeah, we're not trained as a society to read the fine print, whether it's that notice that comes with the utility bill or the cell phone contracts online where it says just check this box. We rarely do like a whole copy paste of like the 13 pages of the contract. And I'm sure as an attorney that he who writes the contract writes it in their favor most of the
Of
time.
course. Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
most people don't, think about that unless they've either been burned or they know someone like Bill, Bob, or Sally that has been burned where their awareness has gone up in their spidey
That's right.
sense.
Or they listen to your podcast and
That's
they've
right.
just now learned it and they've got it all figured out.
Which is very interesting. Most of my listeners are under age 40 for this podcast, but it tells me that their awareness is that they're craving the knowledge and they want to know because my podcast is going to only do well in English speaking countries.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
But and I think I do think you are seeing some generational shifts in there. But one thing, you do have a lot of folks that in that 40-year-old demographic who have parents that are rolling up into their 70s, and oftentimes they're seeing, like you said, they're seeing maybe a friend, they got a childhood friend that's the same age, and their parent has Alzheimer's, and it's been a nightmare of figuring out how to care for their parent, and the stress and the strain. And so yeah, now they're looking at their own situation. They're saying, okay, maybe I need to be having some conversations with mom or dad. What happens if you get in the same boat as these folks over here? Yeah, and so yeah, you are seeing that. And then of course, we've got more access to more information, and people, our lives are so fleeting, and yet people want to know how can they stretch that, and stretch it in the minds of others. And I think it's great. More
Yeah,
people think about it, the better.
absolutely. So the first, when you talk about the big five big mistakes, and I know you've had this conversation for like over a decade now, so here you are.
Sure.
It's kind of like Britney Spears has to like sing her famous song, the 10,000th time on the Las Vegas stage. So you get to repeat it again. So the first biggest mistake is people may not realize the value of the financial power of attorney over the
Mhm.
will. Number two, this idea that if they just transfer their assets to their children, that is the ideal remedy compared to maybe exploring trusts with an attorney. Maybe number
Mhm.
three, it's receiving bad advice compared to exploring at least 2 to 3 different opinions and perspectives out there. What would you say are the fourth and the fifth areas that they just fall into a bear trap and they don't even realize it?
So the particularly when you're talking about your older folks, but this can be applied to just as easily to your younger ones. But if you get to 65, you qualify for Medicare, and at that point you're pretty much thinking, oh well, I've got Medicare paying 80% of my health insurance costs. I pay for a supplement that pays the other 20% of my health insurance costs. And at this point, 100% of my medical care is covered either by Medicare or the supplement. So all of a sudden, I can actually sit back and relax and think my health care needs are taken care of. Now that I've reached 65 and I'm on Medicare, my health care needs are taken care of. And that is a huge mistake. Because I'll tell you exactly what happens. You're gonna have a stroke. You're going to go from the ER to the ICU. You're going to go from the ICU to an admission room. If you're still not getting better, they're going to do some inpatient rehabilitation right there in the hospital. If you still haven't gotten any better, they're going to take you out of that hospital and over to a nursing home where they're going to keep doing some rehab. And that even that rehab, that's going to be covered by traditional health insurance or Medicare for at least a little while. But if you still haven't gotten better in a month or 2 months or 3 months, but you are still not to the point where you can get yourself off the couch to the bathroom and back to the couch, maybe you're going to need to stay at that nursing home. And what you're going to find is that health insurance, that Medicare, whatever it is, At that point, they're saying, look, you've gotten as good as you're going to ever get. Your cost to stay there is no longer a healthcare issue, it's rent. And we don't pay for rent, we pay for healthcare. Except that what you find out is that the rent at a nursing home, it's $225 a day, and that's in rural East Texas. You want to know what it is in the Bay Area?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. For Oregon, where my parents are at, it's like 10,000 a month.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
yeah.
300, 400, 500. I was talking to an elder law attorney up in Boston, and he was saying the average rate of a nursing home was something like $525 per day in the Boston area. Yeah. So yeah, now you're talking 10, 15, $20,000 a month. How many people can afford that for any length of time? Right. I mean, even if you were good and you saved some money and you've got, $200,000 in an IRA and you've got your house and maybe a little savings over here. Well, if you're burning at $10,000 a month, you're going to be broke in a year.
Absolutely.
Maybe,
Some people will know to buy something called long-term care health insurance. I think it's like a Genworth product. I'm not promoting Genworth.
right.
But it's interesting because if someone has to get it, they have to go in kind of when they're young, they're in good health. If not, they'll get turned down.
That's right.
Yeah,
Roughly 5% of the population has long-term care insurance, so a very small percentage. The reason being is that even if you're getting it when you're somewhat young, say like you're getting it at say 50 or 55, it's expensive. And so a lot of people just can't afford it.
yeah. So let's say it's like 400 a month, and if you skip one payment of 400, whoop, it's gone.
That's it. Boop,
Yeah,
boop, off you.
yeah.
Yeah, and so a lot of people, and then the other thing is unlike traditional health insurance, long-term care insurance can deny you for any reason they want. So I had a lady here recently, and she was coming to me to do some planning, but part of that was she had actually thought, oh, I need long-term care insurance. So she went to go apply, and they denied her because she had asthma when she was a teenager. What does that have to do with her risk of being in a nursing home? I don't know. But again, they can pretty much deny for whatever they want to deny for. And so, yeah, you have a bunch of people that can't afford it, a bunch of people that couldn't qualify for it anyway. And so, yeah, you have the vast majority of folks out there who can neither private pay nor have insurance, which means they're going to end up needing some sort of government assistance program, which generally is going to come in the form of Medicaid. That's the only government program that pays for things like nursing home or sitters to stay with you in the home. And these are need-based programs, which means they're going to factor in your assets, but not necessarily all of your assets. Depending on what state you live in and what the rules are in that state, some assets do not count against you towards your eligibility for Medicaid, but others do. And so you can, in some cases, you can have, I'll just give you I'll give you a Texas example real quick. Let's say I've got two people, right? So person number one over here, they live in a $625,000 house. They drive a $250,000 Ferrari. They have $1.5 million in their IRA. All right. So that's person number one. Person number two lives in a $50,000 house in a small town. They got a little rent house that's worth about $30,000, and the renters in there pay about $300 a month occasionally. They got about $10,000 in the bank, and they drive a 1982 Ford Mercury Grand Marquis, right? So car. So these are my two people. We got the $600,000 house, $1 million IRA, and the Ferrari, and we got the 82 Mercury over here, and the house and the little rent house. The rich one qualifies for Medicaid, the poor one doesn't. In Texas, your home doesn't count against you up to $635,000. Your IRA doesn't count against you. Your car doesn't count against you. So that rich guy, he's got a big house, he's got a fancy car, and he's got a big fat IRA, and none of those three assets count towards his eligibility for Medicaid. This other lady over here, she has a house. Well, that doesn't count. She's got an old beat up car. That doesn't count, but she's got a $30,000 rental property. That's a countable asset, and it'll prevent her from qualifying for Medicaid.
Interesting, because the government sees that as a income producing asset.
Right. It's an
Okay.
asset. She could sell that asset and turn it into cash and use that cash to pay for her care. And so here's, I bet if you grab these two people off the street and you asked the wealthy person, said, "Hey, what are you going to do if you ever have to go to the nursing home?" They're going to say, "Oh, well, I'll just private pay for it because I got way too much money to ever qualify for Medicaid." And then you would grab this little poor person over here and say, "Hey, what are you going to do if you ever have to go to the nursing home?" And they're going to say, "Oh, I won't have to worry about anything because I'm so poor." And yet it's the poor one that needs the planning. It's the rich one that probably doesn't, at least not in this context, right? And that's again, going back to my mistakes, right? It's the mistake is your health insurance is not going to get you there. You need to know how you're going to pay for long-term care going forward, because it's terribly expensive and your choices are very limited. And your idea of what those programs are and what they pay for and what they don't pay for is wrong, unless you're just a super nerd like me and you deal with all of this stuff all the time and really get a kick out of it. You're not going to have any idea how these rules and programs work. So, learn and make sure that you're not that little poor lady that thinks she's covered, or
Thinks that
the
she's
or
taken care
or
of.
the right, or the wealthy person who might inadvertently spend all of their money when they didn't have to. You know, but those are both bad results, or both unintentionally bad results, just because of a lack of knowledge on both of their parts. So yeah, that's the fourth one. And the fifth one is actually the fifth mistake in our little list here. This goes all the way back to how we opened the program. And that's the story of Isaac. It's the failure to plan. It's the failure to do anything at all. Right? I mean, you're sitting on the train tracks. You hear the whistle.
The train's
You
coming.
you see the light coming. The light's
Yeah.
getting bigger. It's getting brighter. Whistle's getting louder. And you just keep sitting your butt on the railroad tracks. And you can either get up and get off those railroad tracks, or you're going to get squished by the train, right? But the train is coming. And it's the same deal here. These issues of incapacity, of death, they're coming. They're coming for all of us. We know this. This is not news. But your ability to plan through them in advance, so that when you are in that incapacitated state, or when you have died, that your family is looking back, your loved ones are looking back, and they're saying, "Wow, I'm glad John did those things, because it made it so much easier when he was incapacitated. It made that transition at death so much better." And then, then they forget about it. They forget about my incapacity, and they forget about the transition at death, because it was so easy. It was nothing. It was gone. It's out of their mind. And what's replaced in their mind is the baseball game. It's
The
the
good
soccer game.
times. Yeah.
It's the good times. It's that vacation we went on. It's that time me and that daughter climbed to the top of that mountain, right? It's that sort of stuff. And that's what we want that legacy to be, is we want it to be all of the good things and the values and the memories and all of that sort of stuff, not a process
Or the
that you
suffering,
had to
misery,
endure.
and the, yeah.
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 So there you go.
Yeah, that's lovely. What I'm hoping is that when somebody hears this, they can think, I think the metaphor is like, if you take, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? I think that's the metaphor. And, and my
Yeah,
hope
yeah,
is,
no, that's right.
yeah, is that because I think typically somebody thinks, wow, that is so big. How do I even approach that? And then they don't approach it. Like when you mentioned, well, the train is coming. And so I think that my hope in this conversation is somebody can hear your five little stories for the five biggest mistakes that people make. They go, huh? And it just increases their awareness just a little bit more, to know that maybe I can do something about that. Maybe I can be proactive or take some personal agency, and it's not just so big. I mean, this isn't solving politics for the United States of America. This is just taking care of your financial power of attorney and planning ahead and getting a few expert advice sessions. And
That's it. That's it,
yeah,
right? Yeah. And that's it. I mean, just, get a little bit of advice. Let somebody look at your situation, your facts, your family dynamics, and let that person say, here's what you need to do. Here's a few things you ought to start with, and here's a few decision points that you need to be thinking about. And let that pro walk you through it. Shouldn't be, it's not. And I will say, you will feel better afterwards too. If you are uncomfortable with these sort of conversations, getting that done, getting moving past it, you'll sleep like a baby that night, because it's one thing that you're not worried about anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Peace of mind is a very interesting thing because if you can just make it through the tunnel of fear, that peace of mind is priceless for your soul and
Absolutely.
spirit.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So, Mr. Ross, since this is a legacy podcast, what does the word legacy mean to you personally? And what would you like your holistic legacy to be?
So for me personally, what I would really like is I would like, when I'm gone, I would like for people to look back and say, that's how I want to be. I want to live a life that is how others would want to live theirs. To create, during my lifetime, to create a way for other folks, like my children or my spouse or my other loved ones or my friends, to that they would want to emulate, that they would want to live their lives in the way that I lived mine, that they saw during my lifetime, that they saw peace, happiness, a joy for life, like I said, a little humor, try to take care of yourself and take care of the people around you and express love for one another, and do all of these things. And I would want that to be my legacy, that they would look back and they would say, I am going to try to emulate John, because he was worth emulating. To me,
It
that's a
was,
great that's a great legacy.
yeah, and the example you set.
Exactly. Yeah, right. I mean,
Yeah,
that's it. And not just in one aspect of life, but in all of them, in your professional life, in your personal life. Um, and I think if you think about it in that context, you know, yeah, I mentioned earlier I've got 4 kids, and I think, like with my daughters, I want to be I want to be the I want them to look at me, and that's the way they want to live, and that's the kind of relationship that they want to have. If they find a partner, they want their partner to love them the way I've loved my wife, and that sort of thing, right? I want all of that to be the legacy.
that's lovely. That's lovely. Um, I'm going to guess you're a Bible believer.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know what gave it away. I mean, talking about the Old Testament and such, right?
Yeah, well, I think what gave it away is that you want to, it's not just in your talk, it's in your walk, and you're going to walk it out every day, every day, every day, no matter what comes at you and no matter the landscape that you're in. That your example will speak louder than any words that, could be for show. And I think it's lovely.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My wife, she refers to, like me and my parents, as the Vulcans, and part of that is because those expressions of the words, right? That ending the phone call with love you too," you know, that just doesn't. I honestly, I would be stretched to think of the last time that my mother and dang sure my father have said, "Love you, boy." I just don't, I cannot, right now, as we sit here right now, I cannot remember a time. Um, and yet I do not question it. I don't need to hear it.
Yeah.
And, and I guess maybe that's where a lot of that comes from as well, is if I don't have to tell you that I am living a joyous life if you can see it. And I don't
Yeah.
have to tell you that I care about you if you can see it. You're going to feel it. You're going to know it. And I don't have to ever have to say a word.
You
That's,
can,
you know,
yeah,
yeah, that's the
it's in your presence and somebody can see the piece of Jesus in your eyes.
right. There you go. There you go.
Okay. So should I ask you about guiding principles or values?
Well, you certainly can. Although, I mean, I think it's probably a lot of that same sort of thing, right? I mean,
Okay.
um, as far as like, guiding principles and uh, uh, I will say that I try really hard to be positive and to find the good. Um, I am a glass half full kind of guy. It's and but I would rather assume the best and get burned than to always assume the worst on the one chance that I'm right. And that's just me. That's that and I think that does it expose me to potential damage? Yes, absolutely, because you're going to get burned.
But it's a happier way to live.
But to me, that's a happier way to live. And I think the other thing is to try to be present in the moment, not let things that have already happened that you can't change, right? That's already done, cannot change it. Nothing I can do about it. So fretting about it doesn't help anything. And kind of like talking earlier, which is going to happen? Are you going to have dinner or die? Right? Which one's going to happen first? And the reality is, you honestly really don't know. And because you don't know, if you did know, and it was the bad one, what would you change right now? You
Mm.
know, would you look out when you looked out the window? Would you notice the beauty of the sky and the trees? Would it be prettier if you knew that there wasn't going to be a dinner tonight? Maybe it does. I don't know, but I like to try to think of it in that context, that this is the moment. This is what I've got. It's right now, because I may not have another one. What I did in the past, irrelevant. What's going to happen, also irrelevant, because I don't want to miss out on this particular spot right here.
Very cool. Very cool. That's lovely. Thank you. And I think there's also something to be said when you mentioned love before, whether it was with your family or your parents. Love is like that encouragement that makes, like this is metaphorically, obviously, like the trees grow,
Sure,
in the
absolutely.
abundance that's in the universe, from the seed to the apple tree, that if the nurturing is there, I mean, it's it's just beautiful things can happen. And I would say one of your values, I think, is education, in addition to like the integrity and the honesty and you know appreciating and stewarding what it is that you have and have been given.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right, and both of my parents were college professors, so I probably have some sort of genetic marker for it, but I do like teaching. I like taking my knowledge and passing that along to others, especially if it's something that I think that they will benefit from, that they would take that knowledge and they would personally grow and maybe we're creating some sort of domino effect that's making the world better by sharing that information. So yeah, you're certainly right.
That's a
That's an element of it. You figured me out in one short podcast. You
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a lovely like tea light candle in the darkness, that with that education, it can just ride out the any ignorance, that people don't have to be afraid. They don't have to be afraid of the train that is going to come for all of us.
that's right. That's right.
All right. Well, in closing, I just have my closing paragraph to read, if you'll just bear with me for one quick
Sure.
moment.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So, in closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder of Legacy Planning, a boutique advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, but international in those I coach. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person define, develop, and execute their legacy, and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in your moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content of this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. Thank you for joining us today. And if you are listening on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please remember to rate and review. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And thank you, Mr. Ross, for speaking into your legacy.